Let's float quietly, shall we? Back to a time when staying clean was less of a brisk shower and more of an artisanal ordeal involving ashes, wine, and the occasional urine sprinkle. Yes, before loofahs and lavender-scented body wash, humanity's hygiene habits were ambitious. Now, I don't mean ambitious in the productive sense. I mean in the way a raccoon is ambitious when it attempts to sneak a watermelon through a cat flap. Welcome to ancient personal cleanliness, where effort was great, but results were character building. Let's start in ancient Rome, circa the height of the toga and the height of bath time drama. Oh, Roman baths, a social mecca and the closest thing to an ancient wellness retreat, except instead of green smoothies, you got olive oil rubbed into your skin by a stranger named Lucius, followed by a full body scrape with a tool called a strigil. Yes, rather than using water and soap, Romans slathered themselves in oil, sweated out in steamy rooms, then scraped it all off like marinara from a pizza stone. And to answer a question you never asked, no, they didn't always clean the strigil between uses. They might wipe it, they might not. It depended on how friendly Lucius felt that day. Even the bath water wasn't freshened often. Picture it, a steamy public caldarium where dozens of oiled-up citizens soaked, revealing their political woes and fungus issues in equal measure. It was a bit like going to a spa-themed potluck, where everyone brought their own bacteria. Still, cleanliness was next to godliness, or at least to gossip. Bathhouses were key to Roman society, a place where senators sealed deals, poets scribbled, and people loudly judged others' sandals. But travel just a little east, and you'll enter the Byzantine Empire, where things took a fragrant twist. Bathing became deeply entwined with ritual. The Byzantines adored scented oils, and, even better, floral waters. Some noble women insisted rose water be poured over them by handmaids named things like Euphemia or Nonna. Subtle jets were out. A sort of human waterfall was in. And yet, all that fragrance couldn't always overpower the sheer effort this required, especially since plumbing frequently worked about as well as a mule on roller skates. Water had to be hauled, heated in steaming brick rooms, and then perfumed like an anxious debutante. Bathing was less quick rinse and more brace yourself. But if you think that's quirky, wait until medieval Europe enters the scene. This was a time when the nobility believed water could weaken the body's defenses. Why, you ask? Because medical theory said that opening your pores was tantamount to inviting demons into your bloodstream. And back then, demons were blamed for everything from skin blemishes to sneezing in church. To creatively sidestep water, folks turned to dry cleaning. Not the modern version, but an earlier, crumblier one. Enter the linen shift. Nobles believed that changing their underclothes frequently was the pinnacle of hygiene. Swipe off the sweat with a fine linen shirt, remove, replace, and voila, cleanish. Queens like Elizabeth reportedly prided themselves on how often they changed their shifts, believing this absorbed all the not-so-wholesome elements their skin exhaled. The logic was part alchemy, part wishful laundry science. For peasants, though, it was simpler. A quick dash in the river once in a while, paired with strong convictions and stronger body odor. Soap. That was rare and handcrafted using lye made from wood ashes. Pair that with animal fat, and you had something between a cleaning agent and a rustic candle. Scrub with that, and you were officially the cleanest person within 3 meadows. Still, humans were nothing if not persistent in finding ways to freshen up. Over in Japan, bath culture was a daily affair. Communal bathhouses called sento became as integral to neighborhood life as gossip and rice. The Japanese, since at least the Heian period, believed in washing not to remove sin, but to restore balance and serenity. Hot springs, or onsen, were not just for cleaning, but for healing, often reached after long, lantern-lit walks through misty forests. So imagine this: a daimyo washing off the dust of travel while cherry blossoms drift gently overhead, comparing calligraphy styles with a neighboring samurai. It wasn't just hygiene, it was poetry with steam. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, gently exhale and imagine the linen shifting softly in the breeze, warm olive oil trickling down ancient arms, and a strigil tapping quietly at the bathhouse door. Imagine, if you will, the gentle rustle of reeds swaying along the banks of the Nile. The air is warm, a bit too warm, and somewhere nearby a scribe is diligently chiseling tax records into a slab of limestone. But let's not interrupt him. Instead, let's drift silently into the homes of ancient Egyptians, where the concept of cleanliness flickered with both brilliance and a touch of desert delirium. You've likely heard that Egyptians were obsessed with hygiene, and in truth, that's not far off. While much of the ancient world considered bathing a seasonal activity, the Egyptians bathed daily, often twice. A basin, a servant with a jug of water, and a bar of soap made from animal fat and chalky clay, that was luxury. Imagine starting your day not with a lukewarm latte, but with someone pouring tepid water over your shoulders while birds chirped, and perhaps a crocodile blinked disapprovingly nearby. More than just water, the Egyptians knew the power of scent. Perfumes and ointments were everywhere. You weren't truly clean unless you smelled like myrrh, lotus blossoms, or quite possibly expensive tree sap. Cleanliness was seen not only as purity of the body, but a necessity for pleasing the gods. And trust me, Ra had opinions. Then there were the wigs. Not just fashion statements, these voluminous constructs served the dual function of hiding baldness and keeping lice at bay. Because if you just shaved your head and wore a wig instead, you could avoid the whole bug situation. Sort of like a hat that never judges your scalp choices. The elites, naturally, took things to another level. Women applied green, copper-based eye paint, believing it kept infections away, which it did, sometimes, which also turned their faces into early prototypes of glamorous goblins. A stylish, antiseptic look. Cleopatra herself, despite her dramatic portrayals, might have spent more time elbow-deep in scented oils than in seduction. Few people could pull off a milk bath back then, spoiled goat milk no less. But, oh, she tried. But even for all their bathing rituals, hygiene had its limits. Toothpaste in ancient Egypt was a curious paste made from ashes, powdered ox hooves, and bits of burned eggshells. Supposedly minty. Pre-dental floss era, of course, so food just stayed. A little crunchy mystery surprise for later. And let's not forget the world's earliest deodorant trial runs. Much like an ancient armpit lottery, Egyptians combined cinnamon, citrus oils, and chunks of mineral salts into fragrant pastes they would rub on their underarms. That's right. Imagine working construction in the Valley of the Kings with a lemon salt paste slowly melting into your tunic, while wild dogs sniffed you with curiosity bordering on concern. But this devotion to staying clean, however strange or scratchy, was serious business, especially in death. Mummification wasn't just for show. It was the ultimate spa treatment. Think, detox with real consequences. Organs removed, body drained, wrapped tighter than your great-aunt's secret cookie jar. They even jammed scented resin up the nose to make sure nothing nasty dared escape in the afterlife. And after all that, after the baths, the powders, the lotus-scented linens, you would lie in bed made of woven reeds and close your eyes knowing tomorrow someone would wake you at dawn, not with a ringtone, but with gentle chants and more goat soap. So yes, to be clean was divine in Egypt. To be dirty, well, one did not simply smell badly in the heat of Thebes. One risked spiritual disgrace and maybe even a demotion in the social hierarchy of the afterworld. And who wants to haunt the cheap seats of eternity? But as the Nile drifts quietly past temples and tombs, carrying whispers of powdered wigs and citrus-salted armpits, let's slip further into quieter dreams. A little downstream, perhaps, to another time when being clean, or at least pretending to be, was handled in a far colder way. As the flicker of torchlight glowed faintly over ancient stone walls, and the world outside stirred with the hoot of an owl or two, let us drift, quietly and curiously, into the shimmering bathhouses of ancient Rome, where cleanliness was considered next to godliness, provided you didn't mind sharing your sponge. Ah yes, public baths, the Roman thermae, where senators, soldiers, sandal sellers and slingers of suspiciously fishy snacks all gathered in steamy camaraderie for one reason: to get squeaky clean. Well, mostly clean. The Romans were ambitious about hygiene, though their techniques were occasionally more enthusiastic than effective. Imagine entering the grand archway of a bathhouse the size of a football field, if football had existed, and if it did, it would probably involve togas and gladiators. The first stop inside? The apoditerium, essentially a cloakroom. But be warned, lockers weren't yet a thing. You'd hand your clothes to a slave or wedge them between a wall and a rather judgmental-looking statue of Hercules, hoping no one made off with your tunic. Next, the main event, the strigil. Ah, the strigil. Part scraper, part spa tool, part ancient misunderstanding of how pores work. Romans weren't fans of soap. Instead, they'd slather their skin with olive oil. Yes, the same stuff that modern salad dreams are made of. Then scrape it off with a curved metal blade. Along with the oil went sweat, dirt, old skin cells, and, one assumes, the last remnants of one's dignity. This process often happened in the tepidarium, a pleasantly warm room, like a hug made of humidity. There, you'd recline on a bench, discuss poetry or politics, and pay a muscular attendant to rub you down like a greasy breadstick at an all-you-can-eat symposium. The oil could be plain or laced with luxury, lavender, rose petals, or myrrh if you had the coin. If not, you might get whatever was lingering at the bottom of yesterday's amphora. And of course, let us not forget the communal sponge on a stick, the tersorium, kept in the shared latrines and rinsed in a bucket of vinegar water between uses. It was the ancient world's version of sustainability, and an absolute nightmare for germaphobes. Still, don't knock it. The Romans built aqueducts after all. They knew a thing or two about running water, just not about bacteria. After scraping down and small-talking your way through several rooms of increasing temperature, you'd finally plunge into the frigidarium, the cold plunge pool, where one's pores, and possibly soul, would snap shut in icy unison. It was refreshing, shocking, and reportedly very good for circulation, if not for preventing sudden, involuntary squeals. It's worth noting that these public baths weren't just about hygiene. They were also buzzing centers of Roman life. You could seal business deals, get gossip hotter than a hippocaus floor, or even hire a philosopher to wax lyrical about the cosmos, while you soaked in suds that mostly weren't even soap. It was community, culture, camaraderie, and perhaps one or two unfortunate fungal infections. But hey, when in Rome, even emperors got in on the action. Caracalla, a man known both for his architectural ambition and his habit of stabbing people at awkward family dinners, built a staggering bath complex that could hold up to 1,600 squeaky clean citizens at once. Intricately tiled floors, scrolling mosaics, towering arches, all so you could remove sloughed off skin while mulling over rhetoric or whether your chariot driver was being a bit too familiar with your wife. Of course, these bathhouses weren't only in Rome. They sprouted up across the empire, from the breezy coastlines of Gaul to the rainy hills of Britannia. Nothing says civilized like bringing central heating and body scrapers to a place where the locals still washed in freezing rivers, if they washed at all. In a curious twist of fate, the fall of Rome brought with it not just the end of empire, but a long, cold shower of hygiene ignorance that would last centuries. The aqueducts fell silent, the baths crumbled, and vast mosaics of Neptune slunk beneath moss and memory. But fear not, sleepy traveller. Our next stop is just around the bend and several hundred years into the future, where we'll find that in the Middle Ages, cleanliness became not just rare, but occasionally heretical. So tuck yourself in and prepare for a time when wiping perfume on your underarms passed for bathing, and saints were believed to sweat out piety. Imagine winding your way through the fragrant hills of classical Greece, where the olive trees glow golden in the dying light, and the air smells faintly of time, ambition, and philosophical sweat. Picture, if you will, the great thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, stroking their beards and pontificating about virtue, truth, and metaphysics, all while likely being just a tad pungent. You see, in ancient Athens, cleanliness wasn't necessarily next to godliness. It was more like a polite neighbor that dropped by, occasionally. True, the Greeks were among the first cultures to associate hygiene with health and aesthetics, and they certainly loved their bathing rituals. But the practical execution was, well, let's say, more poetic than precise. They did bathe, but not as we do. Far from sinking into perfume bubble baths with loofahs and bath bombs named things like moonlit jasmine escape, Athenian men and women preferred a good old-fashioned strigil scraping. That's right, no soap, just a little bit of olive oil rubbed onto the skin, followed by a curved metal instrument used to scrape off the oil, dirt, and whatever philosophical pondering had clung to them during the day. It went like this. You oil yourself up like a philosophical breadstick, then have a friend or servant gently scrape your dermal layer like yesterday's soup stock off a countertop. Flattering? No. Effective? Debatable. But for the ancient Greeks, this combination of oil and scraping was the gold standard of self-care. Gyms and bathhouses, called gymnasia, were social hubs where men would gather to exercise, debate, and purge their pores. The word gymnasium itself comes from gymnos, meaning naked, because of course, they did it all in the nude. Imagine, if you will, jogging intellectually alongside a sweaty Socrates while rhetorically questioning the nature of existence, sans underpants. But the Greeks didn't just stop at olive oil. Oh no. They also experimented with ash, clay, and even ground up sand to exfoliate. It seems that exfoliation had more historical street cred than any skincare influencer today could hope for. These natural abrasives were rubbed onto the skin and then buffed off, offering a certain rustic charm. and possibly removing not just dirt, but your top 3 layers of dignity. For fragrances, those who could afford more than the identity of tanned constitution dabbled in perfumed unguents. Think of musky concoctions made from myrrh, cinnamon, and sometimes even animal fats. These were stored in vessels called alabastrons, tiny perfume flasks, which you'd carry around rather like a fashionable deodorant stick if your deodorant stick came from a potter's wheel and was shaped like an amphora. The Greek elite loved their scent so much that laws had to be passed to restrain excessive perfuming. Apparently, there's only so much myrrh one can reasonably waft before a city-state begins to smell less like a symposium and more like a mobile apothecary wagon that took a wrong turn into a bakery. And as with so many things in Greek society, the sprinkling of fragrance and the scraping of sweat wasn't just a matter of personal maintenance, it was rife with symbolism. Cleanliness via oil and scraping was not simply about hygiene. It was about honor, discipline, and the deeply held conviction that men covered in olive oil could, in fact, form the foundation of democracy. Still, people often forget, the women of ancient Greece had their own peculiar rituals. Though kept largely at home, away from the puffed-up philosophers and naked discus throwers, they too embraced oiling and scraping, as well as more elaborate beauty routines that included face masks made from honey, barley, and, because history must always spice up your dreams, a dash of crocodile dung. Yes, crocodile dung. Imported at lavish expense from Egypt, stored in tiny jars, and applied precisely, because nothing says timeless beauty like fermented reptile excrement on your cheeks. And before you dismiss it as utterly mad, remember, we too have shelled out for designer serums made from snail slime, bee venom, or hemp citrus algae extract from a cistern in Denmark. So let us not judge. In the soft flicker of ancient lamps aglow with olive oil and mystery, these rituals persisted for beauty, for virtue, and perhaps for the simple comfort of routine. For even in antiquity, humanity clung to the gentle reassurance that cleanliness, even the odd oil-covered kind, could give life just a bit more luster. And now, as the last traces of scraped olive oil shimmer on the skin of some long-vanished athlete, we wander onward to a distant civilization where bathing took a very different turn. One that involved more steam, more marble, and far, far more dramatic lounging. Somewhere in the shadowy folds of ancient Rome's bustling underbelly, right between the steaming baths and a man trying to convince his goat to climb stairs, lay one of history's most misunderstood inventions, the communal sponge on a stick. Rome, known for emperors in togas and roads that all survived suspiciously well, had one of the most sophisticated sanitation systems in the ancient world. Aqueducts snaked over hillsides like marble spaghetti, moving fresh water from mountain springs all the way into the city, just so a man named Claudius could wash his feet with something other than wine. Public toilets, or foriki, dotted the Roman cityscape. These were surprisingly cozy affairs, arranged conversationally with stone seats lined up next to each other like an open-air book club, albeit with less War and Peace and slightly more awkward eye contact. Here's where things take a turn. Instead of toilet paper, the Romans used a reusable sponge attached to a stick, elegantly referred to as a tessorium. After use, one would rinse it in a bucket of water mixed, brace yourself, with salt or vinegar, and then return it for the next person. Yes, it was the Starbucks bathroom pass of the ancient world, community-based and suspiciously damp. Nightmare fuel, perhaps. But let's not be too harsh. To the Romans, This was a marvel of ingenuity. They looked at a sea sponge and a stick and thought, this is civilization. What's more, the foracae were hubs of social interaction. Business deals were finalized over bathroom breaks. Senators debated policy while discovering just how cold marble can be. Imagine a modern corporate meeting, but you're perched on a stone bench, having a deeply vulnerable moment while Lucius from accounting gives fiscal advice. Now, while the Romans were sponge-sticking their way through sanitation, elsewhere in the world, other methods were being, shall we say, researched. In ancient China, silk was sometimes used as early toilet material, a nod to both elegance and extravagance. One must ponder what kind of wealth you need to wipe with something traded along the Silk Road. Meanwhile, in the Arctic, the Inuit preferred moss or snow, because nothing says good morning like ice on your nether regions. But back to Rome, because once you bring up a vinegar-soaked sponge, it really lingers in the air. The sanitation system extended beyond just bathrooms. The Romans sent over 200 million gallons of water cascading into the city each day, not just for baths and fountains, but for flushing out open sewers called cloacae. Yes, the largest of these was dramatically named the Cloaca Maxima, which translates loosely to mega drain, or more romantically, the Great Sewer. As names go, it lacks charm, but makes up for it in sheer grandeur. Despite their engineering prowess, it wasn't all spotless glory. Slaves often managed these bathhouses and sanitation systems, thankless tasks far removed from the marble-tiled comfort. And as you might imagine, even the vinegary sponge protocol didn't prevent everything. Letters from the time describe outbreaks of plague, stomach ailments, and mysterious smells that no amount of incense could explain. Still, for a society built on conquering much of the known world, they took their hygiene rather seriously. Baths weren't luxuries, they were daily rituals, even if that ritual included standing in line for a hot soak and handing off a sponge baton between strangers. Perhaps there's a lesson in this: humanity's eternal reach for cleanliness, even when it had to get there via mildly horrifying detours. And so you can imagine, in the quiet hours of a Roman evening, cloaked in olive tree shadows and the fading warmth of stone, someone, perhaps an elderly merchant or a retired centurion, was lowering himself onto that cold marble seat, sponge stick at the ready, thinking to himself, this is what separates us from the barbarians. Sleepy irony, really, because some of those barbarians had forests and privacy, and wouldn't be caught sharing a cleaning stick with a stranger named Publius. But before we smear the next part of history with more questionable cleansing customs, let us wander somewhere damp and steamy, and scented not with vinegar, but eucalyptus and gossip. The public bathhouse awaits. In the quiet corners of 17th century Europe, where candlelight flickered across timber-beamed ceilings and chamber pots were still considered cutting-edge home accessories, there existed a rather disturbing fascination with the cleansing power of wigs. Yes, wigs, but not the bright pink synthetic marvels of costume shop flair. No. We're talking about towering structures of woven hair, ribbon, powder, and dreams. The sort of things you'd wear on your head if your goal was to look like a particularly well-groomed layer cake. In this curious chapter of hygiene history, cleanliness was less about water and more about optics. Let's begin with the scalp underneath. Owning one's natural hair was, at the time, not very fashionable, partly due to vanity, but mostly due to lice. Lice were everywhere. on your bonnet ribbons, on your eyebrows, probably trying to unionize within your corset lacings. The quickest fix? Shave the hair right off. Bald as a peeled parsnip. But baldness, especially for the aristocracy, was simply not en vogue. Enter the glorious wig. Think of it as a portable, reusable scalp. Wigs obscured not only baldness, but also the vibrant ecosystems that once thrived in powdered curls. Of course, these wigs required maintenance, but not in the way you might hope. Wig care often meant dousing the thing in white powder made from starch, flour, and other materials that surely encourage mice to take up residence. To keep the powder clinging, a touch of lard or wax was used, rendering the wig a kind of mobile sticky bun balanced atop the wearer's head, which of course explains why they often carried what were known as wig scratchers, long, thin metal rods used to reach up into one's majestic locks and give the scalp a good, satisfying dig. Beneath the wig, the real head was largely neglected. Scalp hygiene, handled by divine providence and between rinse prayers. There was even a grand cultural assumption that the wig itself, by shielding the head from the sun, wind, and general attention, somehow counted as clean. It was, in many ways, the powdered sugar equivalent of sweeping dirt under a rug, except the rug was stapled to your head. The aristocracy particularly loved these wigs, not merely as hair substitutes, but as symbols of status. The taller your wig, the more important you were presumed to be. There existed entire careers dedicated solely to wig architecture. There were wig engineers, wig sculptors, wig whisperers. Some creations stood over 2 feet tall and required careful balancing, not to mention a neck made of emotional willpower and very strong vertebrae. Naturally, the taller the wig, the harder it was to clean. But, as always, human beings are inventive. Some wig owners hired specialists to comb through their coiffed confections with tiny brushes and vinegar-soaked cloths. Others perfumed their wigs into submission, creating a halo of floral deception around what was essentially a nest of historical confusion and mouse droppings. By the 18th century, wigs had reached such absurd heights, figuratively and literally, that people began storing small objects in them: fruits, fans, letters. One rumor tells of a society lady keeping an entire roast quail in hers as an emergency snack during the opera, which, if true, represents either the height of luxury or a gross misunderstanding of poultry safety. But despite all this Baroque bravado, the wig era was not eternal. When revolutions and enlightenment crept in, so too did questions like, why am I wearing a hot, flammable tower of flour and rodents on my head when I could just bathe? And thus, wigs began a slow, powdered decline. Cleanliness, real cleanliness, would eventually be rediscovered. But those powdered monuments remain a testament to humanity's eternal willingness to do anything to appear clean, without actually getting wet. As the last flecks of starch drift through our sleepy thoughts like dandruff in a dream, let us drift toward another era, where bubbles and brushes take a back seat to breath and body odor. For next, we wander into the mystifying realm of ancient deodorants, where herbs, stones, and truly baffling logic attempted to make the air around you simply less offensive. Somewhere in the crisp, linen-scented corridors of mid-18th century France, an elegant lady named Madame de Grandpré delicately dabbed her temples with a kerchief dipped in rosewater and vinegar. Why? Because she had just completed what was, by the standards of the time, a luxurious bath, not with soap and water, of course, but by being gently sponged down with warm milk and brandy while reclining on a chaise longue lined with velvet. It was a cleansing ritual fit for nobility, designed more for indulgent repose than actual cleanliness. You see, by the Enlightenment era, soap was around. It was just deeply suspicious. It had an unfortunate reputation for being a bit too harsh, too vulgar, too effective. So cleanliness became more about what you could mask, perfume, or dab away. And thus emerged the noble art of aromatic avoidance, washing oneself without water, and preferably without standing up. The French elite, ever innovate in their dainty approach to hygiene, developed a whole arsenal of quasi-cleaning methods that looked impressive, but achieved very little. Dry shampoos in the form of starch powders were massaged into wigs and hair, absorbing oils and odors before being combed out, theoretically. In reality, it left a person smelling faintly like someone had spilled flour in a dusty apothecary, but in a very expensive way. Perfume gloves became another tool for olfactory deception. These were no ordinary accessories. They were soaked in scented oils, think lavender or orange blossom, and worn not just for fashion, but for the noble purpose of gently waving them under one's nose whenever a particularly medieval smell wafted by. After all, one never knew when a chamber pot might be emptied out of a second-story window. Speaking of aromas, if you thought air fresheners were a 20th century invention, think again. The gentry used pomanders, ornate, perforated, balls packed with herbs, spices, and dried flowers, which could be dangled from belts or carried like stylish, spicy grenades. A casual whiff of one was soothing, and also, frankly, a defensive gesture in a world where water was feared, sewage was brave, and bathing was a last resort. But not everyone was parading through Versailles in a cloud of orange blossom and denial. In the countryside, peasants had more practical, albeit equally questionable, methods. It was common, for instance, for people to bathe in rivers, especially during the warmer months. Never mind what else was floating by. Dirt, at least, could be beaten off with enough splashing. The real gem of the era, though, was the communal bathhouse. No longer as popular as they had been in the medieval period or the ancient Roman days of steamy decadence, European bathhouses of the 1700s existed in a slightly awkward social limbo. Some operated as legitimate washing facilities. Others were more social than sanitary, with a reputation halfway between a spa and a whispered scandal. In Turkey and parts of the Islamic world, however, the bathhouse, or hammam, remained a revered institution, standing as a proud bastion of actual cleanliness. Structured around ritual purification, hammams boasted steam, scrubbing, and pleasantly echoing chambers of marble and calm. Visitors were exfoliated with vigor by people who had clearly gone to Loofah school. It was profoundly effective, and left most Europeans both envious and mildly confused. Expectedly, many travelers returned home with tales of miraculous Turkish bathing, believing they'd discovered Atlantis with towels. Back in France, however, a new idea was percolating. One that would eventually call into question centuries of powdered wigs, vinegar wipes, and perfumed gloves. It began in quiet corners of science, and with an unlikely hero, the humble bar of soap. No longer just an artisan curiosity, it was being studied, refined, and, imagine the audacity, recommended medically. But that, dear listener, is a tale still lathering to life. As candlelight flickers low and the scent of lavender and rosewater drifts across time, let's gently close the velvet curtain on this fragrant chapter and step softly toward a place where medical minds and maverick cleanliness collide. in the quiet mist of ancient China's Tang dynasty, somewhere between poetry and porcelain, hygiene was embraced not as a chore, but as an elegant art form, albeit one that occasionally wandered into the realm of the peculiar. Let us tiptoe, socks optional, into the powdered sandalwood-scented boudoir of the Tang nobility. Here, cleanliness included a series of fragrant pageants that would make even a modern-day spa blush politely and ask for a tutorial. Now, where most mortal folk of our own time might lather up with a convenience store body wash scented vaguely, like mountain breeze, which never really resembles any mountain or any breeze, the Tang elite took their olfactory matters very seriously. Public baths were widespread during this age, but the gentlefolk had extras, rituals, decisions, starting with face washing. Instead of good old soap and water, Tang dynasty beauties used what must surely be the ancestor of filtered skincare TikTok, a powder made from crushed mung beans. Yes, mung beans. Those little legumes you might recognize most often doing their best in a sad salad bar were once crushed lovingly into a fluffy greenish powder and used to wash the face. This mung bean marvel was thought to cleanse gently, brighten the complexion, and presumably leave one smelling slightly like a spring roll. But the secret weapon of this hygiene routine was not mere cleanliness. Oh no, it was presentation. One did not simply scrub. One purified with intention. In a ceramic basin etched with clouds and cranes, with water infused with flower petals, and sometimes an awkwardly floating citrus fruit, added more for prestige than practicality. Hair, too, had its moment in the spotlight. Long and often elaborately pinned, hair was considered a sacred canvas of personal expression. Shampoo? Not quite. The Tang approach was a paste of ground rice water, herbs, and sometimes fermented peach juice. Yes, fermented. The belief was that the slight acidity assisted in cleaning and also blessed one's locks with a shine envied even by moonlight itself. And if you're wondering whether fermented peach juice is just a poetic term for wine poured absent-mindedly on the head, let's just say, some nobles may not have known the difference, especially after a very enthusiastic poetry recital. Meanwhile, those without celestial wealth weren't entirely without options. Street-side bathhouses buzzed with activity, offering not just warm water and herbal steam, but the latest news, gossip, and, if you were lucky, a free bowl of pickled radish afterward. For many in the bustling cities, cleanliness was as communal as it was practical. A soak, a scrub, a shared moment of humanity. Even mouthwash had its peculiar place. The tooth-rinsing water of choice during this period was often brewed from clove and mint. But sometimes, inexplicably, peppercorns were added for extra zing. These people were not playing around with morning breath. It's no wonder that Tang poetry often begins with someone sighing and staring into the moonlight. They probably just survived a swish of clove pepper potion. And when it came to fragrance, the line between hygiene and performance art blurred delightfully. Perfume pouches, known as xiangnang, were worn as accessories, stuffed with dried petals, powdered spices, and sometimes ambergris, which, by the way, is whale vomit aged beautifully by the ocean until it smells like heaven. These little pouches were the air fresheners of the empire, portable, poetic, and often used to flirt. You can picture it, now, two young lovers passing each other in the twilight markets, silks rustling, one subtly brushing their xiangyang past the other's sleeve. There are no words, just a whiff of aged cinnamon and whale bath. Romance is alive. There was an almost dreamy understanding in the Tang worldview that cleanliness wasn't harsh or clinical. It was fragrant and fluid, a beautiful thing, celebrated in verse, decorated in jade. But of course, not everyone cleaned with peony-scented water or scrubbed behind their ears with fermented fruit. Beyond the polished echelons of Tang high society, rural folk still bathed wherever nature provided: streams, rivers, and an occasional monsoon. They may not have had mung bean powder or perfume pouches, but they surely understood the joy of a cool dip at dusk after a long day of planting rice. As twilight stretches its lavender fingers across history, and the sounds of metal hairpins and clove-laced whispers fade, we drift onward. Soon, far across land and sea, we'll tumble gently into the traditions of another civilization altogether, where staying clean involved smoke, sweat, and occasionally a shoe. In the heart of the Middle Ages, nestled between castle walls and roving livestock, a curious question often lingered in the perfumed, or more often pungent, air. If water couldn't always be trusted, soap was a luxury item, and baths were suspiciously linked to the plague. How exactly did people attempt to stay clean? The answer, as it turns out, was dust. Yes, dust. Not the kind that gathers politely in the corner of your attic, but the kind that noble women patted onto their faces with the confidence of a modern influencer using translucent setting powder. These were cleansing grains made from crushed herbs, roots, and even chalky earth. Substances believed to absorb impurities, mask odors, and maybe distract from the general chaos of 14th century hygiene. You see, in medieval Europe, bathing wasn't always seen as the height of cleanliness. Oh no. Open pores from hot water baths were believed to make one vulnerable to everything from sickness to possession by mischievous demons. So instead, people rubbed themselves with cloths, leached oils with powders, and relied on linen undergarments that were diligently changed, weekly if you were lavish, or with the arrival of a comet if you weren't. Monks, leading lives of cleanliness in spirit if not body, had a particularly dry approach. Physical bathing was rare, but spiritual purification was abundant. And so was the use of wimples and long robes, which functioned as both fashion and filtration devices. A monk could go months without a bath, but if his hands were grimy before handling a manuscript, well, he might give them a ceremonial swipe with rose water or a handful of sand. That ought to do it. In Islamic societies, by contrast, things were far more, how shall we say, water forward. Hammams, or public bathhouses, were not only popular, but pious. Cleanliness was cherished, both for health and holiness. Soap making had already become something of an art form in the Arab world, centuries before it drifted over to the reluctantly washing hands of Western Europe. But let's drift back to the less water-friendly corners of Christendom. Larders and bedrooms stashed with potpourri sachets, gloves lined with scented herbs, beards perfumed with vinegar swipes. Imagine a knight in shining armor, freshly dusted with powdered marjoram, galloping into court smelling like an ambitious salad. Meanwhile, in Tudor England, Queen Elizabeth there, famously bathed, occasionally, maybe once a month, whether she needs it or not. But she was scrupulously fond of clean linens. She changed them constantly, believing that fresh, bleached fabric wicked away impurities. Let this be a comfort if you, too, consider laundry to be a form of self-care. It once counted as a full hygiene system. And what of the feet, those weary, travel-worn extremities? Well, they were often soaked in wine and spices if one had the coin, or simply wiped with a slice of onion. Yes, That same bulb that makes you cry in the kitchen was once the medieval equivalent of a foot wipe. One can only speculate whether it masked odours or simply joined the party. There were also cunning little tricks for keeping fingernails acceptably cleansed. Ladies might dip fingertips in lemon juice or vinegar, hoping both to shine the nails and deter nail biting, which was considered most unbecoming unless you were under siege. Or 5. Among the most beloved tools of pre-modern hygiene was the strigil, a curved metal scraper used in Roman and later Byzantine times. Though well before the Middle Ages, its spirit lived on in dry scrubbing rituals, where one scraped or rubbed the skin with cloths or brushes, casting off dead skin and presumably regrets. In fact, dry cleaning the human body long predated its arrival in upscale garment care services. If you ever wiped your hands on your trousers when a napkin was out of reach, well done, you're tapping into a millennia-old tradition. And so, people pressed on, scented and powdered, diligently scraping and dabbing, smelling faintly of lavender and effort. Through it all, cleanliness was less about eradicating germs, which no one yet knew existed, and more about managing one's aura of respectability. As twilight settles over the hay-strewn medieval streets, we'll quietly pull away from the scribe rubbing her arms with spiced flour and drift toward another curious tale, one that involves the ancient and strange hygiene instrument so beloved. It was worn in the nose, in the cool hush of the Scottish Highlands, where mist curls like question marks around ancient stone cottages. A certain fragrance once danced through the heather-laced air, not lavender nor the wood smoke of a cozy hearth, but fermented human urine. Yes, we begin here. Long before lemon-scented cleaners and orange extract hand soap, humans relied on far earthier products, some only a few evolutionary steps removed from pure chaos. And among the boldest sweethearts of this aromatic era, the medieval fullers, cloth cleaners, textile bathers. They were the dry cleaners of the day, if your dry cleaner worked barefoot in a bucket of stale pea. You see, in the Middle Ages, fuller's earth wasn't always accessible, so people turned to what they had in excess: stale urine. It was gently referred to as lant, a poetic term for, well, aged human output, collected carefully in buckets, sometimes by neighbours, sometimes from passers-by on a pub crawl. Nothing says community like, could you leave a little something in the pot on your way out? Lant, once fermented, produced ammonia, which had the chemical properties to clean cloth of grease and soften it during the manufacturing of wool. Workers would stomp merrily on wool soaked in lant vats. Picture a rustic spa. Soothing. Work for the feet, provided you're not too bothered by the aroma of eau de chambre pot. Of course, one might think this was an isolated practice, a quirky footnote perhaps, but no. Wander east to ancient Rome, and we find the scent of ammonia is still very much alive and regrettably, well. The Romans, being terribly clever and tragically pragmatic, also discovered that urine could be quite useful. So useful, in fact, that Emperor Vespasian famously imposed a urine tax on the collection and sale of public urinals' contents. When asked about the indignity of taxing bodily waste, he is said to have replied with that eternal shrug of Roman efficiency: pecunia non olet, money does not stink. Vespasian might have been a penny-pinching pragmatist, but his vision paid off. Urine was collected from Rome's public latrines, long stone benches with keyhole-shaped holes cut into them, and honestly, more social than a modern gym. The substance would then be sold to laundries and tanneries, cleaning togas and whitening teeth. Yes, Teeth. It turns out that before modern toothpaste arrived to tingle your tongue with artificial mint, people sought out whatever could polish a grin. In ancient Rome, a swish of Portuguese urine was considered an effective tooth whitener. The ammonia brightened your smile, if you could hold it long enough through the gag reflex. The Romans weren't alone. Across cultures, the concept of clean was less about smelling like a meadow in April and more about whatever removed dirt, grease, or the odour of last week's turnip stew. Back in Elizabethan England, perfumed gloves came into vogue not merely as a fashion statement, but as a defence mechanism. Since full-body bathing was rare, partly due to the belief that water could open dangerous bodily pores, nobles wore gloves doused in rosewater or ambergris, pressing them to their noses to survive the close quarters of public events or especially enthusiastic banquets. Perfume wasn't just a finishing touch, it was a survival strategy. But back to our uric adventures, because oddly enough, some cultures took it one step further. In 18th century France, the aristocracy's preoccupation with grooming created what you might call olfactory denial. Lavish palaces often lacked indoor plumbing, so chamber pots lined the hidden corners of Versailles with all the decorum of a party balloon left after Mardi Gras. Locals even coined the term eau de Versailles, a scent not available at your nearest department store. Amid the elaborate wigs and silk brocade, a faint, persistent bouquet of human reality floated behind every powdered countess and foppish courtier. Yet, as long as one reeked of lavender oil and superiority, the whole thing seemed perfectly civilized. Human beings, it turns out, have an extraordinary talent for forgetting the strange things they once endured in the name of cleanliness, or, as it often was, the illusion thereof. But we're not finished wandering yet. Not while corners of history still whisper oddities into the night, like the monks who brushed their hair with goose fat, or the 16th century idea of bathing once a year as an act of piety. And perhaps, if we tiptoe just a little further down that dim corridor, past the buckets and barrels and faint echoes of chambermaids swearing under their breath, we might find ourselves somewhere even stranger, a place where soap was considered a suspicious foreign habit, and dry sand was the cleaning agent of choice. On a crisp morning in ancient Rome, not the cinematic Rome with sweeping orchestras and dramatic battles, but the everyday, very slightly smelly Rome, you might wake up to the sound of sandals slapping cobblestones, the scent of baking bread, and drifting faintly through the air. Ammonia. Yes, ammonia. You see, the Romans were many things. Imperial, philosophical, oddly obsessed with lead, but above all, they were practical. And when it came to cleanliness, nobody could accuse them of not giving it their best, occasionally over gross effort. Take the humble Roman laundrette known as the Phalonica. On the outside, an ordinary workshop. Inside, it's a rather bubbly affair. Imagine a series of shallow stone vats, each one holding water, soap-like substances, and the pièce de résistance, human urine. Why urine, you ask? Well, dear dream traveller, ancient Romans discovered that urine, being rich in ammonia, made for an excellent degreaser. It was the original biodetergent, and so professional fullers, essentially ancient dry cleaners, would stomp on the soiled togas in warm urine mixtures, a task that could charitably be described as both aerobic and aromatic. Now, naturally occurring urine doesn't just fall from the skies. It needs to be donated, which is where Rome's public urinals came in. Known as piss pots, though far more dignified in Latin, these receptacles were placed along busy roadsides, happily collecting contributions from passers-by. It became such an accepted practice that Emperor Vespasian famously taxed the urine collectors, leading to the phrase "money doesn't stink," pecunia non olet, when someone questioned taxing bodily fluids. It was a strange economy, but practical and rather circular as these things go. After the garments were trampled upon in their pungent baths, they underwent a post-soak spa day, rinsing, brushing, beating and sun-drying. Some even received a touch of sulfur or chalk for whitening, because nothing says elite prosperity like a blindingly bright toga that smells faintly of public restroom. And while we're on the subject of Roman innovations, consider their bathhouses, marble-clad hubs of social bathing where cleanliness and gossip flowed as freely as the heated waters. However, in order to fully appreciate the mosaic-floored elegance of a Roman thermae, you had to first endure an experience best described as roasting in your own soup in the caldarium, a steaming hot room that opened your pores and your vision simultaneously. Patrons would sweat profusely, scrape off the grime with a curved instrument called a strigil, and then dunk themselves in the frigid frigidarium, which was excellent for circulation and presumably waking up from the sudden realization that you were essentially a human stew. And yet, even with all their innovations, the Romans were not immune to the occasional hygiene hiccup. Lead pipes, for instance, were all the rage. Durable, malleable, and only slightly poisonous. A minor inconvenience like your dinner guest accidentally burning down your villa. What's most endearing, perhaps, is the sheer variety of cleanliness rituals. Some wealthier Romans used perfumed oils in excess, not so much to mask body odor, but to turn it into olfactory theater. A person walking past a noble's villa would occasionally catch a swirl of myrrh, rose, and perhaps whatever wine had splashed during bath time conversations. And yet, for all their pungent detergents and elaborate baths, many Romans still viewed bathing as partly moral. A clean body reflected a clean soul, or at least one that hadn't tripped into anything indecent on the forum that day. Of course, not every Roman had access to marble tubs and the philosophical hygiene debates of Stoic bathers. For the average plebeian, cleanliness was achieved with a cracked basin, a borrowed bucket, and a Stoic flinch. Still, one can picture the cityscape, steam rising lazily from the public baths at dusk, children laughing near the aqueducts, distant trumpet notes from a harbour festival, and somewhere nearby, the ever-perceptible tang of a Phalonica at work. Laundry day, ancient style. Now, as the stone step cools beneath the toe of your strappy sandal, and the strigil gleams in the last golden light, drift with me away from Rome. In the hush, another tale murmurs on the horizon of monks, monasteries, and the curious sound of cleanliness echoing down candlelit halls. By the grace of history's oddest whispers, we now find ourselves beneath the thatched roofs of medieval Northern Europe, a place where the air is thick with the scent of peat fires, damp wool, and other things less poetic. The year is somewhere around the 13th century, though no one here is obsessing over calendars. Time rolls on with the church bells and the village gossip, and cleanliness, for all its current charm, is regarded as both suspicious and, to many, morally ambiguous. Let us unravel, like a damp linen tunic, the curious case of medieval moral hygiene. You see, for a time, many Europeans believed that being physically clean could actually weaken your soul. Or worse yet, lead to vanity, which was a sin. And if you sinned, demons could dance about your person with alarming ease. Washing too often especially with warm water, was thought to open the pores, and with open pores, one might as well put out a welcome mat for illness. The body, like a crumbling chapel, was safest if sealed tight. In this light, thick layers of dirt served not as filth, but as armor. Perhaps not comfortable armor. But then again, no one ever claimed chivalry was fragrant, and so the average villager might bathe once a year, typically in May, before the summer festivals. It was a sort of annual spring cleaning, like scrubbing out the hearth or chasing chickens from the rafters. There's even a slightly dubious folktale that June weddings became traditional because that was the moment when most people had their yearly bath and were at their social peak, olfactorily speaking. As for the aristocracy, well, they were even stranger. Kings and queens had access to private wooden tubs, sometimes perched on wheeled platforms and lined with linen. They could be filled with warm milk, flower petals, or wine, depending on how dramatic the monarch felt that day. One French queen is reputed to have bathed in donkey milk to preserve her skin. Whether it worked is unclear, though it certainly strained the local donkey economy. But while water could be suspicious, perfumes were not. In fact, wealthy folks delighted in masking their natural bouquet with layers of ambergris, attar of roses, marjoram, or even vinegar-soaked cloths tied delicately around the neck. If your body couldn't be washed, then it could at least be misleading. History, you see, has always respected a good cover-up. Clergymen of the time offered excellent advice for remaining physically clean while remaining spiritually unsullied. Chief among these recommendations, dry washing. This did not mean using a fluffy towel or a cheeky puff of lavender dust. No, dry washing involved lightly rubbing your hands together while thoughtfully considering your sins, followed perhaps by swatting some dust off your sleeves and calling it even. To further cleanse the soul, public flagellation, rituals were a popular pastime. Picture, if you will, a group of barefoot penitents marching through cobbled streets, chanting somber hymns and swinging leather whips upon their backs. Bodily discomfort was considered deeply spiritually enriching, and in many ways, this emphasis on internal, rather than external, purification made medieval cleanliness more about battlefield tactics than beauty routines. In cities like Paris and London, communal bathhouses did exist, Turkish-style steamy dens, where a person could sweat out impurities before being scrubbed down by strong-willed attendants wielding coarse cloths. But such establishments were soon eyed with suspicion. A hot bathhouse, after all, was the perfect setting for sin to simmer, or stew, or bubble up like a misbehaving stew pot. By the time the plague arrived, many bathhouses were shut down altogether, blamed not for their poor sanitation, but for their presumed moral filth. Thus, the cleanest people were often the most ostracized. If you arrived in a village crisp and linen-clad, people might cross themselves quietly and whisper, "One of those modern ones, probably from the city." It's an awful lot of effort to avoid smelling too suspicious. And yet, there were always outliers. A few brave souls shrugged off the stigma of soap and water, declaring their love of cleanliness louder than the church bells. Their tales, while rarely celebrated, linger in the dusty corners of forgotten manuscripts, unseen footnotes of rebellion, though not necessarily floral-smelling ones. For now, as you rest your thoughts on woolen pillows, stuffed with straw and perhaps a few accidental beetles, let us drift from these fragrant medieval corridors. There's a fresher breeze awaiting, scented faintly with citrus and a whisper of Renaissance ambition. As the moon glides sleepily across the sky and the night deepens, we find ourselves tiptoeing into the fragrant realm of medieval perfumery, where cleanliness was often more of a fragrant illusion than an actual pursuit, and where scent trumped soap in the hierarchy of hygiene. Picture a medieval noblewoman, her gown impossibly elaborate, rustling through a great stone hall. She's not bathed in days, perhaps weeks, but oh, does she dazzle the senses with a perfume concoction of rose oil, crushed cloves, lavender, and possibly a dash of civet, a substance derived from the glands of a very confused and mildly resentful cat-like creature called a civet. The objective? Not to wash, but to mask. Bathtubs were for the brave or the medically recommended. You see, in many parts of medieval Europe, water was seen as suspicious at best. There existed a persistent belief that water opened the pores, which, in turn, allowed all manner of evils, real or superstitious, to sneak in. And so, instead of regular bathing, an entire olfactory arms race developed. Scented gloves soaked in aromatic oils served as portable air fresheners for the literal hands of the elite. Wealthy women would press these fine gloves to their faces, pretending it was the fashion, when in truth they were simply trying not to inhale their surroundings. Similarly, pomanders, small perforated balls made of silver or gold and stuffed with spiced resins and herbs, were worn about the neck or held up to the nose like aristocratic inhalers. Imagine trying to flirt in the court of Louis XIV while clutching a pocket-sized metal sphere of cloves and cinnamon to your face. Subtle, it was not, but hold on. Louis XIV himself adds a bit of sparkle to this story. Known as the Sun King, Louis is famously rumoured to have bathed only twice in his entire life. Sources vary, and perhaps exaggerate, but what is astonishingly certain is this: he adored perfume. Versailles was essentially a living, drafty perfume bottle. Royal corridors were awash with scents designed to veil not just body odours, but also the lingering aromas of chamber pots, stables, and spoiled wine. Perfume makers, or noses, as they were sometimes called, held a peculiar and somewhat contradictory power in French society. They crafted art not from paints or stone, but from fermented blossoms, musky tree resins, and animal entrails so pungent that they'd make a goat rethink its life choices. One particularly prized perfume component was ambergris, a waxy, greyish substance found bobbing around in the ocean after being secreted by the intestines of sperm whales. Somehow, medieval perfumers discovered that once aged and sun-dried, ambergris developed a deeply complex, almost sweet scent, which of course raises the evergreen human question. Who was the first person to sniff a whale's digestive anomaly and think, "Ah yes, bottled treasure"? Still, for many, the power of perfume was spiritual as much as sensory. Scents were believed to protect against disease, especially during plagues. It was common to see physicians wearing long, beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, the beak acting as both a filter and, one imagines, a powerful deterrent for anyone considering small talk. And if your olfactory budget didn't stretch to civet, musk, or ambergris, not to worry. Folk remedies abounded. Dried rosemary bundles under the armpits, vinegar foot baths, even garlic rubs for the more daring scent connoisseur. Each offered varying degrees of effectiveness and social impact. What's most charming, in its own slightly nose-wrinkling way, is the earnest hope behind it all. Generation after generation, devoid of our precious bubble baths and refreshing deodorants, clung to the idea that if they could just outwit the stench with enough clove-stuffed gloves and whale vomit, they could fool their neighbours and maybe divine judgment into thinking they were properly clean. And so, as the twilight deepens and the civet quietly sulks in its corner of history, we drift onward into the next chapter of humanity's curious relationship with cleanliness, this time with our attention turning not to the body or its fragrant facades, but to the rather dramatic little war once waged between people and their own hair. At the eastern edges of the Byzantine Empire, nestled where the dusty Anatolian plains meet the whispering winds of the Bosporus, lived people with glorious robes, golden icons, and absolutely no idea where soap came from. They did, however, have vinegar, gallons of the stuff, though we may now associate vinegar with overly ambitious salad dressings or a bold choice in chip flavoring. The Byzantines prized vinegar for its perceived cleansing and balancing properties. So devoted were they, some elites took to soaking their feet in it, and even dabbing it behind the ears, as if preparing for a date with destiny, or at least to smell less like the streets of Constantinople. And there were those who believed in fasting, not just for spiritual purification, but to clean the body by giving it less to do. Nothing goes in, they thought, so surely nothing lamentable will come out. This may be effective if you took vows of both silence and stillness, like the Stylites, those famously pious monks who perched atop stone pillars for years at a time in the name of holiness, cleanliness, and quite possibly avoiding the stench of daily life altogether. One Stylite monk, Simeon the Elder, is said to have spent 37 years atop his pillar, through baking sun and howling wind, with little protection besides a tunic, steadfast faith, and perhaps the occasional unsolicited bird. It's not that Simeon bathed. Rather, he didn't on principle. And the principle was something like, if God wanted olfactory daintiness, he wouldn't have invented camels. The result may not have been a delightful aroma, but rather a saintly stink, a scent so sacred pilgrims flocked just to catch a whiff of his spiritual essence, or perhaps to confirm quietly just how far conviction can carry a man unwashed. Still, not all unconventional cleanliness rituals happened atop lofty perches. In nearby Armenian highlands, shepherds were known to roll in the morning dew, a practice both poetic and practical. The morning dew, like nature's silent sponge bath, left behind a glistening sheen and a vague sense of freshness, at least in the few minutes before the sheep tried to reintroduce their own distinct aromas. Let's not forget about the rather curious act of smoke bathing. Among some Central Asian nomads, including Turkic peoples, bathing in water was seen as risky to one's health or honor, especially during the harsh winters. So instead, they turned to smoke. Yes, smoke. Clothes were hung above fires, and people squatted near smouldering embers, allowing the aromatic smoke of pine and juniper to waft over their skin and tuck gently into their hair. The end result? A kind of cedar-scented human brisket that, while hardly sterile, was arguably more presentable than 3 months of winter's accumulation. It was, quite literally, getting smoke to get clean, which, depending on the herb in question, might double as spiritual elevation or just a really confusing dream. In the shadowed monasteries of Ireland, monks believed that icy river baths shocked the sin out of the system. The colder the bath, the purer the soul. So while a pious brother dunked himself in the River Shannon, shivering in sanctity, he might recite psalms with blue lips, pushing both body and spirit toward immaculate purity, or possibly pneumonia. Still, it was noble, a damp kind of nobility. What these varied customs showed, whether involving vinegar, fasting, fire smoke, or chilly creeks, was the stubborn human longing to feel clean in a world that, for most of history, was stubbornly not. Behind the dust and spice, behind the philosophical grime and theological perspiration, there was always an effort, a hope, that by tapping into nature, or the divine, or the bottom of a vinegar barrel, people might rise above their own bacteria, if only briefly, if only by smell. Because really, what is cleanliness if not the pursuit of dignity? A way for our fragile, funky flesh packages to pretend, if just for a moment, that we are more than our sweat, more than our greased up realities. And while bathing in smoke or balancing on pillars may not earn spots in modern dermatology journals, it did reflect something tender, something timeless. The effort to scrub life's chaos from skin and start fresh, even if it was just symbolic. Of course, symbolism has limits, especially when it's 90 degrees and you've been fasting in wool for 6 days straight. Still, the ritual marched on, in the realm of scent, sin, and smoke. And in another distant part of the world, a new contender for cleanliness crept into the story, bathed not in symbolism, but in dirt. Because sometimes, to get clean, people got dirty first, in a small corner of history, where the flickering lantern light met, mud-streaked windows and chamber pots were still all the rage. There existed an unshakable belief in the purifying power of smoke. Yes, not soap, not water, not even a brisk handshake with a hot towel, but smoke. Welcome to the world of fumigation, medieval edition, where your bath was basically a barbecue for one, minus the ribs. Humans, you see, have forever been obsessed with what they smell like, especially before we figured out that soap didn't bite and bathing didn't steal your soul. Let's drift gently back to the Tudor era, a time when wigs were tall, ruffs were taller, and people often skipped bath day. Not because of laziness, but out of sheer terror. Believe it or not, it was once widely accepted that warm water caused the pores to open, which, unfortunately, was considered a VIP invitation for the plague to saunter right in. You could bathe, sure, but only if you were in the mood to die dramatically afterward. Enter the aromatic art of fumigation baths. The idea: sit in a sealed wooden cabinet, or more accurately, a well-modified cupboard, and allow a medley of herbs and kitchen curiosities to be burned beneath you. The resulting smoke would rise up and supposedly cleanse the body through your pores. You weren't washing the dirt off as much as you were encouraging it, kindly but firmly, to evacuate your premises via fragrant eviction notice. The most popular herbs for these no-flame spa sessions included rosemary for purification, chamomile for its calming scent, and occasionally a slightly panicked clove of garlic for vampire avoidance presumably. The smoke was thought to carry the healing properties into every crevice of your very soul, or at least your armpits. Of course, as with most pre-modern hygiene solutions, two glaring problems arose. First, people sometimes fainted from sitting in an enclosed box filled with rising smoke. And second, the body might smell less like a rotting onion afterward, but instead more like smoked venison. Still, the logic was there somewhere, like a breadcrumb lost in a pocket. If fire purified tools and smoke warded off demons, then surely it could make you less offensive to your fellow man. Or at least mask the fact that you hadn't seen a bar of soap since childhood. But the smoky spa treatments weren't limited to England's gloomy coast. In parts of Eastern Europe, entire fumigation saunas existed where the goal was to sit in fragrant fog until you were either cleansed or hallucinating. In Poland and Russia, the banya was a beloved institution, though thankfully they added water somewhere along the smoky path. There, stones were heated until glowing and then splashed with water infused with herbs. The resulting scented steam would make even the most stubborn medieval grime surrender. Even royalty got in on the herbal haze. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, and a woman with a nose famously capable of detecting inferior perfume at 50 paces, was known for commissioning perfume steam chambers. Her steamy sanctums were filled with floral vapors intended not just to cleanse, but to spiritualize. There's something poetic about pretending your pores are inhaling lavender enlightenment while you're quietly sweating through a 15-layered brocade gown. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, physicians in the Islamic Golden Age offered far more advanced fumigation techniques, often combining scent, steam, and actual medical logic, which at the time was considered cheating by European standards. Of course, as candles dimmed and centuries turned, the ritual of smoke bathing grew less popular, possibly because modern hygiene discovered it's more effective to douse oneself in bubbly water than to sit in smoky solitude smelling faintly of pot roast. Still, there's an undeniable charm to the image. A quiet cabinet, a curl of rosemary smoke, the soft crackle of herbs on coals, the belief that heat and scent could chase away not just dirt, but demons. A tender, hopeful attempt at self-care from people who hadn't yet met Mr. Clean. And as the fragrant mists fade and the faint aroma of scorched thyme lingers in the air, we find ourselves drawn silently, like smoke through a chimney, toward another curious human invention for staying clean, or at least pretending to be. Let's take another step onward, shall we? This time, into the curious world of luxury powders and how smelling like toast could be considered desirable. Somewhere in an ancient Roman villa, the scent of lavender, sweat, and ambition dances gently through the air. A patrician reclines on a marble bench, wrapped loosely in a toga so white it would make modern dry cleaners weep. Around him hums a gentle chaos, slaves scurrying with oils, strigils, and jars of fermented fish paste. Yes, fermented fish paste. But we'll get to the fish in a moment. The Roman Empire wasn't all gladiator games and dramatic dagger-related betrayals. No, the Romans were also some of history's most dedicated bathers. They didn't just bathe. They bathed with the gusto of someone trying to cleanse both their skin and their sins, with extra emphasis on the former and rather less attention to the latter. Public baths, known as thermae, were not merely about hygiene. They were spas, gyms, business centers, gossip hubs, and maybe a little Tinder, all wrapped into one. You could come for a soak and stay for a debate about Cicero's latest speech, or just stay to stare dramatically into the steam and pretend your life was being soundtracked by a lyre. But here's the foamy twist. Bathing in ancient Rome involved very little soap. In fact, Romans found the idea of applying a slick, slippery bath to themselves a bit barbaric. Instead, they relied on olive oil. Yes, the same golden nectar now drizzled onto your overpriced artisan bread was, once upon a time, the height of personal cleanliness. A Roman would enter the caldarium, the hot room, like a sauna's older sibling with better masonry, and sweat generously. Then, another person, often a slave called a balnita, would slather them in warmed olive oil. The oil would seep into the pores, mingling with dirt and whatever questionable decisions they'd made in the forum that day. Then came the strigil. Now, picture a flattened metal spoon with an attitude. The strigil was scraped across the skin, collecting the oil, sweat, and grime into something that looked like what you'd find at the bottom of a teenager's gym bag. And then it was collected, disposed of? Oh no. There are whispers that some rather luxurious lotions and cosmetics were made from this gloop. Nothing went to waste in Rome. not even you. And about that fish paste, garum. Though more condiment than cleanser, garum was everywhere in Roman life. Did a little splash make its way onto the skin and get rubbed off with oil and pride? Possibly. One can only hope they didn't invent fish-based essential oils. Despite all this elegance, cleanliness wasn't just a matter of olive oil and ambition. The bathhouses themselves were marvels of engineering. Heated floors, the Hippocrates system, aqueduct-fed fountains, and rooms that transitioned seamlessly from Arctic to volcanic. They would move from the Laconicum, a dry heat room, to the Frigidarium, a room so chilling, even your regrets got goosebumps. But not everyone in Rome was a fan of the public bath. Some Stoic philosophers declared it morally troubling, too immodest, too indulgent. Seneca himself grumbled about the noise, the grunts of muscular bathers, the slap of water, the shrieking of epilators. Others feared diseases, contagions passed in the steam. Still, the baths persisted, for centuries, like the world's most indulgent wellness trend. Of course, far from the marbled heart of Rome, people had to improvise. On the outer edges of the empire, think windswept Britain or the squelchy Germanic, woods, people tried their best with what they had. Cold rivers, puddles of ambition, or perhaps just hope. And sometimes they skipped bathing entirely and just added another layer of clothing. Instant hygiene camouflage. Now drift, dear listener, like steam off a Roman bath, into the next gentle mystery of our curious past, where a different civilization, equally fragrant in its own way, found cleanliness with claws, herbs, and a hint of fermented milk. Let us drift, dear dreamer, to the 18th century, a time when powdered wigs, scandalous ankles, and a surprising number of hygiene hopefuls tried valiantly, if not always elegantly, to outsmart their own body odors. We are now entering the world of sweat prevention strategies, a field of human innovation that had more ambition than deodorant and far fewer success stories. The heart of our tale is somewhere between the armpits of old Paris, lingering beneath the velvet-lined coats and perfumed waistcoats of Europe's noble elites. You see, while soap existed, and even cleanliness had its occasional admirers, the water situation was a bit awkward. And by awkward, I mean regarded as a potential highway for diseases, shame, scandal, and possibly frogs. This peculiar fear of water meant bathing was something one did rarely, cautiously, and only after intense debate and possibly a religious consultation. So, to stay fresh, or at the very least, to provide an illusion thereof, our clever ancestors turned to an army of powders. Talcum powders, scented dusts, and mixtures of crushed herbs were generously applied in all directions. Inside wigs, down bodices, across nether regions no historian dare mention before the second cup of tea. Lavender, rose petals, orris root, all ground into thin pajama cloud softness, were dabbed behind ears and down necks, the 18th century version of a spritz behind the collar. This wasn't just hygiene, it was a sensory smokescreen. But one must never forget the patch. Ah yes, the indispensable, often flirty beauty patch, a small black velvet adhesive applied to one's face to cover smallpox scars or blemishes. But it doubled as a bold statement. Yes, I remain stylish, despite my questionable hygiene habits and the fact I bathe with more suspicion than soap. Yet, even in this powdery haze, the issue of sweat remained, because as it turns out, all the lavender in France is no match for a summer in silk corsetry. So, many turned to linen, lots of it. The logic went like this: rather than wash your body, Simply wear layers upon layers of linen undergarments to absorb the sweat. Then, instead of washing yourself, you launder the linen. This was called the linen shift method, and it was fairly popular. Some even thought it was better at cleaning the skin than water. I change my linen thrice a week, noble ladies might boast at candlelit dinners, delicately spooning something gelatinous while their wigs silently absorbed the room's humidity. Bathing, meanwhile, might happen once a year during Lent, or someone's wedding, or if a comet appeared and made everyone anxious. Still, some inventive souls attempted more personal innovations, like stuffing dried moss or vinegar-soaked rags into their armpits. A delightful touch of forest chic. There are mentions in some corners of history of lemon slices being wedged beneath the arms, though experts disagree whether this was for antibacterial purposes or to terrify one's suitors. And yet, it wasn't just the aristocracy who attempted to outwit body odor with aplomb. Soldiers' kits during Napoleon's campaigns contained colognes sometimes referred to optimistically as toilet waters. These pungent potions were splashed liberally in place of washing because in fields of glory there were no bathtubs, just glory and a lot of musk. Still others swore by vinegar washes, believing that if whiskey was good enough to clean wounds in war, perhaps vinegar could cleanse life's smaller, smellier afflictions. One might wash with vinegar, then follow up with rose water for the perfume. This was hygiene via salad dressing. Eventually, in the late 19th century, scientists began to whisper ideas about bacteria, and manufacturers grew curious about a thing called aluminum chloride, which, when applied under the arms, did something extraordinary. It made you not sweat. It also made you itch, sting, and possibly re-evaluate your life choices. But it was a start. As we tiptoe out of this dusty, powdered century, with its layers of linen, its citric armpits, and its elaborate fashion statements, we prepare to wander into stranger territory still. What if the secret to staying clean involved bears, bathhouses, or boiling yourself like an early stew? But let's not rush. Gently now, close your eyes and float forward through time, where steam awaits and towels are optional. Somewhere between the monasteries of medieval France and the outhouses of Tudor England, there existed an alarming devotion to smells. Not good ones exactly, just smells. Our ancestors, bless their well-intentioned nostrils, genuinely believed that air, especially the foul variety, was the gateway for disease. This meant that the world of hygiene was less about scrubbing and more about scenting or smothering. And few took this idea further than the physicians of Renaissance Europe, whose answer to disease prevention came neatly packaged: the fashion-forward, bird-like plague doctor mask. Now, picture this: a tall figure in a long black robe, gloves, boots, and most famously, a beaked mask that looked like something between a Venetian carnival and a very confused crow. It wasn't meant to be terrifying, though it absolutely was, but practical. You see, those long masked beaks weren't just for style. They were stuffed like a bad 17th century charcuterie board, only instead of meats and cheeses, they held dried flowers, herbs, vinegar-soaked sponges, and even things like ambergris, which is, quite disturbingly, whale vomit. Delightful. This olfactory armor was constructed with one goal: to ward off miasma, or what they believed was bad air laced with invisible death particles. Miasma theory was all the rage among Europe's medical elite, and if you couldn't clean your hands with soap, you could swaddle your breathing holes in rosemary and marjoram. The idea was that if disease wafted in through one's nose, then plugging the nose with a mini herb garden might just do the trick. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But we can't scoff too hard. After all, Center Shield hygiene had been lingering on the civilized palate for centuries. The Romans used perfumed oils to bathe when they could be bothered, and the nobility of Versailles preferred clouds of must to masks of cleanliness, insisting that a bar of soap was no match for a strong cologne and a heavier wig. And in many early societies, a person wasn't truly clean unless they left your company sneezing. So if you've ever awkwardly oversprayed yourself with cologne before a date, you have accidentally participated in a centuries-old tradition. Meanwhile, back in the world of plague doctors and their curious bird masks, it's important to remember that these unsettling hygienic heroes weren't just walking bottles of potpourri. They were also carrying long wooden sticks, not as weapons, but as social distancing tools. With plague raging through cities, doctors didn't want to get too close to patients, so instead, they prodded folks from a polite distance, gently poking symptoms into the open or checking for signs of death, like a fussy waiter assessing fruit at a market. Smell good, poke far, pray harder. That was essentially the treatment plan. Now, the masks themselves, though bizarre, tell us volumes about how people conceptualize cleanliness and disease. In a time before microscopic knowledge, bad smells equaled bad health. Therefore, anything that could overpower a stench became its own ritual of purification. Some doctors even carried nosegays, small bouquets meant to be sniffed when passing particularly pungent alleyways. Think of it as a personal air freshener, though highly ineffective when surrounded by rotting refuse and medieval open-air sewage systems. It is worth noting that very few people, not even fellow physicians, took comfort in the sight of a plague doctor. Their arrival in your neighborhood was often seen as confirmation that things had taken an unfortunate turn. If one came poking at your front door, you weren't about to schedule tea. You were lighting candles and making your peace with the saints, all while hoping his scented beak brought luck as well as lavender. From today's point of view, these long-nosed figures might look like the embodiment of superstition and charlatan's fashion, but it was, astronomically speaking, an earnest attempt to understand the invisible, a kind of nasal optimism, a belief that one could keep death at bay through a fragrant filter and a stick of proper length. So while we now know that soap, not sage, is the real defender of human hygiene, we must lovingly admire the absurd poetry of it all. How people tried to perfume their way out of plague, poking misfortune with a glove-tipped wand, walking incense burners wrapped in wool. And even as the sleepier hours creep in, let your thoughts wander softly back to the flicker of torchlit lanes, the creak of leather boots upon cobbled streets, and the faintest scent of rosemary carried on the wind, as we drift just a little closer to the peculiar world of medieval bathing beliefs. If you strolled through 17th century Europe with a time-traveling nose plug and a strong constitution, you might overhear a conversation, or rather a frightened whisper, about the Great Sweat. No, it wasn't the opening night of a Renaissance gym, though that would explain the codpieces. This little moment in hygiene history takes us not to a soap-splashed bathhouse, but instead directly under a heap of woolen blankets, where sweating your sins and your dirt away was all the rage. You see, humans have long associated cleanliness with cleansing the body from the inside out. And in the days when plumbing was scarce, water was suspicious, and bathing too often was said to invite illness, or worse, enthusiasm. People turned to sweat as nature's rinse cycle. Enter the sudatorium, the stube, and the sweat lodge. Now, let's be clear. Nothing wrong with a good, solid sweat. Snuggled among stones and cedar, steam room traditions date far past our sleepy European friends, weaving across cultures and continents for thousands of years. But not all sweat sessions were created equal. Some merely detoxified your body. Others tried to detox your sins. And some were just very damp medieval misunderstandings. In Tudor England, for example, sweating houses were considered a legitimate part of medical treatment. The idea was simple. Wrap the patient up in layers like a human baked potato, then roast them over slow heat until the pores opened and the bodily humours rebalanced. Humours, of course, being the thinly veiled ancient excuse for not understanding anything. Doctors would prescribe a sweat cure for nearly everything: coughs, colds, bad dreams, oddly placed freckles. Sometimes herbs were tossed into the fire for added therapeutic flair. Rosemary for remembrance, sage for smudging, lavender for blocking out the scent of centuries. Add a root or two, and someone might start calling it alchemy. But here's where the story takes a turn, and a bit of a precautionary tale. Because while sweating was a means of purification, many early European towns believed that water was to be feared. Baths, they preached, could open the pores to mischief. Mischief in this case being damp air, which the medical minds dubbed miasma, invisible vapors that floated around sick people, lingering like gossip and infecting anyone foolish enough to inhale. So in a curious paradox, sweating was good, waterless sweating. But bathing too often? That was risky business. It's as if they were halfway to discovering hygiene, then took a left turn because a doctor with a powdered wig looked particularly certain. Curiously, across the ocean, various indigenous cultures of North America had been using sweat lodges for centuries, not as a substitute for soap, but as part of spiritual renewal. These lodges were sacred spaces, built from bent branches and sealed in hides or blankets, designed to house stone-heated rituals of cleansing that stemmed from deep tradition. There, steam and ceremony mingled, but it wasn't about avoiding water. It was about finding balance, communing with the earth, and quite possibly sweating out the last 3 seasons of poor decisions. Back in Europe, though, the sweat cure became increasingly theatrical. Wooden huts built specifically for sweating would employ a fire underneath a specially prepared floor. Once hot enough to poach a chicken, in went the ailing or unwashed guest, wrapped in linens, hoping their fevers would flee and their complexions clear. Some towns rented out public sweat chambers, like the earliest, clammiest spas. And if you think that sounds luxurious, consider the fact that some of these places doubled as meeting spaces, or as crime scenes when the sweating got out of hand. Steam and secrets, it seems, go hand in hand. Even Henry VIII tried the sweat cure, though let's be honest, the man sweated just from the burden of his robes and regrets. Some claim the Great Sweat of 1485 helped end an epidemic, though modern science would politely frown and gesture toward basic hygiene instead. Eventually, as soap regained its bubbly reputation, and indoor plumbing became less of a magical idea and more of a reality, sweat sessions evolved. Saunas stayed, spas blossomed, and people began to understand that water was not, in fact, a malicious sprite looking to infect your liver. Still, sweating it out under heavy blankets, herbs steaming underfoot, and the air thick enough to make tea from, there's something rather charmingly gloomy about it. A reminder that humans, time and again, have leaned on the tools they had: blankets, fire, and a firm belief that your personal demons could be steamed away with enough conviction. As the heat fades and our imaginary sweat chamber cools to a whisper, let's wander gently into our next tale. The curious rise of scented gloves, powdered wigs, and a perfume industry built not on vanity, but pure, gloriously fragrant desperation. Somewhere beneath the sun-drenched sand dunes of ancient Egypt, where jackals yawn and the Nile glides like a sleepy serpent, a series of curious hygiene rituals was quietly unfolding. Rituals so elegant, so elaborate, and sometimes so, aromatic, that even Cleopatra herself might have wrinkled a tasteful nose. Let's start with wigs. Yes, wigs. In the golden days of Upper and Lower Egypt, both men and women often went around completely bald, not out of fashion rebellion or an enthusiastic midlife crisis, but for hygiene. You see, no hair meant fewer lice, less sweat trapped under curling locks, and a smoother skull canvas for ceremonial grease. Naturally, instead of leaving their domes exposed to the burning kiss of Ra, they wore intricately braided wigs, crafted from human hair, date fibers, or, and we say this lovingly, a particularly courageous goat. But these were not your average cosplay wigs. Egyptian wigs were serious business. Status symbols scented with fragrant oils and often tucked away in cedarwood boxes like sacred pets. The nobility would even apply scented beeswax to their wigs, ensuring that a morning stroll didn't just make one appear majestic, but could single-handedly counter the stench of a bustling marketplace full of fish and camels expressing strong opinions through their hooves. And then there was the cone. Yes, the cone. Imagine arriving at a party, your shoulders bare, your tunic crisp, and atop your carefully arranged wig, a cone of perfumed fat, shaped like a soft-serve swirl and melting slowly down your head all night long. It wasn't sorcery or avant-garde ice cream. These cones of fragranced animal fat were infused with myrrh, frankincense, or lotus essence, designed to gradually melt under the desert heat or steamy temple celebrations. As the evening wore on, your cone would slowly glide along your temples, drizzling scented joy down your neck. By midnight, you'd be a slick, glistening olfactory masterpiece, puddles of perfume accumulating politely in your collarbone. The logic, oddly sound. Why reapply perfume when you could wear a time-release cone of luxury? Scent and scalp conditioning in convenient pyramid packaging. Meanwhile, downriver from glistening head cones and fashion-forward goat hair, the common folk also had their own hygienic hustle. Bathing was done in the Nile, modestly, strategically, and always aware of crocodiles with questionable intentions. Soap, as we know it, hadn't quite arrived yet, but the Egyptians did have a clever substitute: soapwood plants boiled into cleansing paste, and a substance charmingly called natron. Ah, natron, the multi-purpose powder that thinks it's better than everyone. A divine combination of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate, natron was used for cleaning bodies, cleansing clothes, and mummifying relatives. It doesn't get more all-purpose than that. Rub a little on your arms, freshen up your laundry, and when your uncle eventually checks out of this mortal plane, guess who's making a final appearance? Natron, the silent MVP of ancient cleanliness and eternal preservation. Of course, oral hygiene was not neglected. While toothbrushes were centuries away, the ancient Egyptians wielded frayed twigs like dental wands, brushing diligently with crushed mint, iris flower, and sometimes powdered ox hooves, which admittedly sounds like a prank one plays on an unsuspecting cousin. Still, dental care was revered, and medical papyri from 1500 BCE describe remedies for mouth stink and gums that leak, which suggests that yes, Even in the days of pharaohs and pyramid schematics, no one wanted to be the guy with breath that chased away the ibis. And oh, the obsession with smell. Egyptians believed that pleasant aroma was connected to moral purity. If you smelled good, you were clearly a better person, a divine candidate, a trustworthy friend who probably wouldn't steal your grain stores when you weren't looking. To stink was a spiritual embarrassment, so priests would bathe up to 4 times a day, limiting body hair and covering every crevice with the fragrance of choice. Blue lotus blossoms soaked into oil, sweet-smelling resins, and of course, more fat cones than you could shake a staff at. So next time you light a scented candle or dab some perfume on your neck, remember, you're part of a proud lineage of humans who really didn't want to smell like people. Whether melting cones of myrrh or a quick dip in a crocodile-adjacent river, they did what they could, with what they had, for the noble cause of good smells. And as the Egyptian night stretches its starlit limbs across a desert sky, we drift on, past pyramids and perfume priests, toward the next strange chapter in our sleepy little tale. As the moon glides lazily over the rooftops of long-forgotten villages and the occasional medieval privy, let us drift now to the Ottoman Empire, a civilization of grand architecture, fragrant spices, and, curiously enough, some of the most luxuriant bathhouse culture the world has ever seen. Yes, dear listener, tonight we enter the steamy, marble-walled world of the hammam. And no, that's not the name of a new yoga position or a trendy herbal tea. The hammam was the social, spiritual, and scrubby heartbeat of Ottoman hygiene, an experience that sat somewhere between a divine ritual and the world's most vigorous exfoliation session. Now, to set the scene, imagine entering a domed chamber with warm, echoing acoustics, lit by little circular skylights that look like constellations punched directly through stone. Steam spills through the air like a sleepy fog, and all around you are murmurs, laughter, the occasional dramatic splash, and, somewhere in the distance, the unforgettable sound of someone getting smacked with a wet cloth in the name of cleanliness. Bathing here wasn't just a matter of soap and water. It was theatre, ritual, a sweaty, sudsy opera where your body was lathered, pounded, and steamed into something vaguely resembling rebirth. The Ottomans had inherited the love of the communal bath from the Romans and Byzantines, but as they were prone to do, they added their own flair. A visit to the hammam often lasted several hours and involved multiple stages: undressing, sweating, washing, scrubbing, rinsing, sweating again. A quiet sit, a drink of sherbet, fruit-based, not fizzy ice cream, and perhaps a philosophical debate about the merits of rosewater over sandalwood. Now, let's talk exfoliation, because the Ottomans took slapping off one's dead skin about as seriously as we take removing browser history after watching questionable documentaries. Enter the mysterious figure of the telak, the professional male attendant in the men's bathhouses, or the nata, his counterpart in the women's baths. Their job? To scrub. With vigor. Some might say malice. Armed with rough mitts known as kese, they attacked layers of tired skin like a historian attacking a conspiracy theory. Patrons emerged pink, glistening, possibly confused, but undeniably clean. Legends say the scrubbing was so effective, 1 second of resistance could result in finding the sins of your great-grandfather being exfoliated from your shoulders. Despite the intensity, or perhaps because of it, many Ottomans visited these bathhouses weekly, or more often, if they were hosting a wedding, preparing for holy days, or just in desperate need of gossip. Because yes, hammams were also where alliances were forged, marriages arranged, prayers whispered, and secrets traded over bowls of rosewater, while someone in the corner wondered if their elbow would ever forgive them. And as much as we tend to believe our ancestors were more tolerant of dirt, the Ottomans rather feared it. Cleanliness was woven deeply into Islamic practice, where ritual washing, wudu, is part of daily spiritual hygiene. But the public bath turned that practice into an art form, with added steam. Even the architecture of the hammam was designed to coax a body into relaxation. Circular stone slabs in the center of the hot room, known as göbektaşı, or navel stones, were heated from beneath. One would lie there like a briefly marinated grape leaf, melting into the marble as a mist of lavender-laced water filled their dreams. But to the outside world, these practices often seemed excessive or suspicious. European travelers, burdened with a healthy distrust of water and a firm belief in the power of scented wigs, eyed the lavish cleansings with raised and perhaps unwashed eyebrows. They misunderstood the importance, even the sanctity, of shared cleanliness, chalking it up to Oriental indulgence rather than a smart way to not die of plague. The irony, of course, is that the same skeptics were wandering around 17th century Paris, perfumed to the eyeballs, because they believed soap might offend the soul. So in the warm arms of Ottoman soap suds, we find ourselves enlightened, or at least exfoliated into clarity. Sometimes the path to cleanliness ran not through starkly lit bathrooms with too many toothbrush advertisements, but through vaulted domes filled with lemon-scented air and the echo of centuries-old chatter. Let us step softly now, dripping with historical humidity, from the hammam and into a much stranger, more pungent chapter, one involving monks and something called holy dirt. But that tale deserves its very own steam. Somewhere near the banks of the Nile, long ago and slightly before cheap shampoo, we find the ancient Egyptians, builders of pyramids and purveyors of personal grooming habits, far more refined than one might expect in an age without plumbing. While the rest of the ancient world dabbed itself with oils and hoped for the best, the Egyptians took cleanliness rather seriously, though not always with methods we'd categorize today as dermatologically approved. For starters, let's talk hair, or more specifically, let's talk about the enthusiastic removal of it. Egyptians believed that hair was a sign of impurity. Head hair, body hair, suspicious tufts behind the ears, all risked offending the gods and accumulating dust. So what did they do? They shaved it off, often entirely. Upper-class men and women would depilate themselves with obsidian razors, seashell tweezers, or a daring little recipe made of sugar, lemon, and glum resignation. Early sugaring paste, if you will. To protect their scalps from the sun and their vanity from baldness, they would don wigs. Oh, the wigs. These weren't dusty costume party leftovers, but high-fashion masterpieces made of human hair, date palm fibers, and in particularly elegant cases, silver and gold embellishments. A nobleman's wig was his crown. A noblewoman's wig, her carefully stacked architectural feat of poise and pomade. Speaking of pomade, ever tried styling your hair with ox fat and scented resin? Ancient Egyptians did, delighting in concoctions that both dazzled and, in summer temperatures, slowly slid down one's temples like particularly floral molasses. But hey, no shampoo, no problem. For their famous daily cleansing rituals, the Egyptians had structure. Wealthy households featured a personal servant, whose job was essentially ancient spa therapist and all-purpose washer. Water was poured from jugs over the person's body while standing on a slatted floor, the dateless ancestor of the modern-day loofah grown nearby. Soap, as we know it, didn't exist, but fear not. They whipped up their own bubbly blend using natron, essentially a salty soda powder scooped from dry lake beds. Natron, not only a key ingredient in mummification, but also your go-to shower scrub, multi-purpose, if slightly desiccating. Cosmetics were also an essential part of everyday hygiene. This was no leisurely vanity routine. You wore makeup to ward off evil spirits, and wonderfully, the sun. Men and women thickly painted their eyes with coal, not only because it looked fabulous, but because chunks of lead in the coal did, in small doses, offer real antibacterial properties. So yes, you might have been poisoning yourself very slowly to prevent a nasty eye infection, but at least you looked stunning doing it. Mouthwash. Oh, darling listener, of course they had mouthwash. The recipe, however, might not pass your modern minty standards. One version included crushed herbs with water. Okay, so far so good. Then came myrrh, a bit of natron, and occasionally ground up mouse bones. That's right. Apparently, nothing freshens breath quite like the whisper of rodent calcium. Their obsession with cleanliness wasn't just about personal preference, mind you. In Egyptian society, being clean was entwined with being holy. Priests were the peak performers of the purity pyramids. They bathed multiple times a day, shaved all body hair, and donned fresh linens before even glimpsing a temple threshold. The gods were considered lovers of order, and any trace of disorder, say, a dusty foot or an untended armpit, was an offensive offering indeed. Even the dead, bless them, were cleansed with ceremony and gusto, as if their journey into the afterlife required nothing less than a deep cleanse and a full spa day. Their skin oiled, perfumed, and wrapped in layers of fine linen after a natron bath. Probably the only time in history when being pickled in salty powder was a sign of luxury. When you think about it, there's a dreamy logic to it all. In a landscape of golden sun and shifting sands, where death visited often and the afterlife loomed large, staying clean wasn't just about comfort or vanity. It was a way of insisting that there was order in existence, that one could stand polished, perfumed, and pink-cheeked before the great gods and say, "Look, I tried my best." Now, as twilight drapes across that ancient river and the scent of lotus still lingers on the breeze, imagine slipping into the silent hush of a moonlit bathhouse, somewhere far off in another culture that also believed cleanliness was next to godliness, but went about it in much stranger ways. Somewhere between the fragrance of medieval lavender sachets and the disagreeably honest funk of the 17th century armpit lies a curious chapter of cleanliness that history doesn't whisper about nearly enough. Let your eyes grow heavy and your mind wander with me now, as we drift to a time of unclean water, questionable decisions, and heroic attempts at personal freshness using, brace yourself, urine. Yes, dear dreamer, urine. The honourable, golden-hued elixir of yore. Before you recoil entirely, know this. Ancient civilizations revered the contents of the chamber pot for more than just disposal. To the Romans, urine had cleaning potential. Truly. In fact, the Latin phrase fullones laborant wasn't a creative way to say cleaning day, but rather an ode to the fullers, laundry washers who used fermented urine to bleach fabric and remove grease. You see, urine contains ammonia, which is a naturally occurring cleaning agent. And while a brisk splash of lemon-scented detergent might seem preferable in our modern world, in ancient Rome, if your toga needed refreshing, someone likely stomped it gleefully in a vat of aged urine. possibly while humming. This somewhat pungent practice wasn't limited to socks and tunics. In the grand tradition of why not, some Romans and later Renaissance beauties believed a carefully applied bit of urine, sometimes even imported Portuguese boys' urine, because evidently location mattered, could clean their teeth and whiten their smiles. Now that might raise one of your eyebrows a touch, and rightly so. But here in this sleepy corner of history, we respect a good effort. And oddly enough, it may have worked. Ammonia, when swished with gusto, can indeed kill some bacteria. Minty fresh it was not, but perhaps breath fresh enough for a society where public bathing had already become somewhat of a social gamble. Now, let's tiptoe across continents to China, where personal hygiene once included a delicate process involving wasp nests. Not for scrubbing, no, but as a resource for medicinal cleansing powders. Crushed nests, if you will, used in combination with ground herbs like iris root and fragrant resins. Still sounds nicer than a ladle of pee. Then off to India we go, where Ayurvedic texts, those ancient scrolls of bodily wisdom, laid out detailed routines for cleanliness. Oil pulling, much trendier today among smoothie influencers, was once a spiritual act, where sesame oil was swished each morning to draw out impurities. Tongue scrapers were sacred tools, and copper vessels stored water not just for its beautiful glow, but for its naturally antimicrobial properties. The entire process blurred the line between hygiene and introspection. You weren't just cleaning your body, you were polishing your soul. In medieval Europe, however, polishing anything, body, soul, or squire's boots, meant navigating a post-plague suspicion of water. Public bathhouses, once quite merry places of bathing, gossiping, and the occasional loot, fell out of favour. Water, people said, was porous and carried disease straight through the skin. In fact, overwashing was feared. Many switched to dry hygiene, which included rubbing the body with linens, brushing off dirt, and dousing oneself in enough rose water and spices to confuse bees. From these fragrant plumes of denial emerged an entire perfume economy. Gloves soaked in orange water, wigs marinated in lavender stew, and, historical applause please, tiny silver pomanders filled with dried herbs, worn on belts and swung beneath one's nose like a weapon against stench. Let's not forget the science-minded souls of the Islamic Golden Age, who catalogued cleansing rituals with stunning precision. Al-Razi, a polymath and physician, described treatments for skin ailments that sound almost spa-worthy today. Baths with sulfur, ointments with rose extract, and recommendations against overuse of harsh cleansers. Balance is key, he wrote, proving that even in the 9th century, dermatology was in beta. But what does all of this tell us as we curl deeper under our blankets? Perhaps that the concept of clean has always danced delicately between tribal tradition and curious experimentation. From fermented bath water and urine-scrubbed laundry to oil rituals and powdered wasp nests, humans, bless them, have always pursued cleanliness with a blend of sincerity and outrageous creativity. And as eyelids lower and the stars of history glimmer above us, let the scent of dried rose petals and the distant echo of a Roman laundry song accompany you into tomorrow's tale, where the final rituals of personal freshness await in one last peculiar twist. As we drift toward the final flicker of candlelight in this tale of ancient cleanliness, let us pull the curtains gently on one last peculiar practice, the bedtime ritual of the powdered wig and perfume patch. Yes, the very same mighty mops of curls and cascading coils once perched atop the powdered domes of Europe's elite. wigs so huge and elaborate they had their own ecosystems. Royal heads wore them like flowering gardens made of horsehair, goat hair, and blind optimism. But their origin? Less fashion, more infestation management. You see, back in the 17th and 18th centuries, lice were less of a nuisance and more of an intimate companion. They nestled in natural hair with a tenacity that no amount of brushing or trench-level scratching could dissuade. So one revolutionary thought took root. Why not just shave your head entirely and wear someone else's hair on top instead? Thus began the reign of the powdered wig, a detachable hair system you could remove, dust for critters, and scent within an inch of its life. Cleanliness, you see, became a question of camouflage. Before heading out for a duel, an ambassadorial ball, or just another thrilling day at court. Observing the ceiling, gentlemen would sit still as servants dosed their wigs with white powder made from starch or crushed bones. Yes, literal bones. They transformed their heads into flowery landscapes, a strange symbol of order and hygiene, even as their real scalps underneath resembled something closer to a gooseberry bush in need of pruning. And the ladies, oh, they made architectural miracles out of it. Some stored fruit in their hair, real, actual fruit, or tiny toy ships sailing upon oceans of pomade. The smell, somewhere between sugared pastries and forgotten basements. But beneath the burden of fashion lay an odor war. Perfumery became both art and armor. With baths still treated with suspicion, too many baths weaken the spine, warned some 18th century quack behind his mahogany desk. The body became a battlefield of scented patches. These tiny, sticky velvet bits were affixed to the skin, not only as flirtatious fashion statements, but as deodorants in disguise. And when applied to places like the jawline or the corner of one's eye, they also doubled as coded conversation. A patch near your mouth might suggest you were open to flirtation. A patch on the temple, possibly mourning, or maybe just covering a blemish that looked like a map of the new world. It was skincare camouflage, centuries before TikTok hacks and cucumber iPads. Just, well, a little more flammable. Now, we'd be remiss not to circle once more around the idea of sleep. After all, that's where we are now, tucked under imaginary blankets, listening to the whir of history's oddities. But imagine falling asleep in a shared 18th century home, surrounded by wigs resting like sleeping poodles by the hearth, a stray cheese tucked inside someone's coiffure to ripen gently overnight. It wasn't unheard of. Those towering wigs often doubled as storage. What else could you do with half a watermelon-sized hairpiece but treat it like Tupperware? And as families lay under woolen blankets, often fully clothed, layers and all, they might glance at their chamber pots, their shoe-washing basins, their fingertip-sized soap slivers made from rendered animal fat, and think, what a convenient modern age this is. Even royals in all their perfumed plumage faced nightly decisions of lubricant and lice pouch management. It was not unusual for someone of considerable status to assign a servant the task of, shall we say, midnight wig maintenance. Think of it as flossing, your whole head, and beyond palaces and powdered mines, the more humble country folk had their own sleepy rituals. In some corners of rural Europe, families still bundled together in communal beds beneath layers of straw-filled mattresses, soot-darkened ceiling beams above, occasionally catching the gentle crinkle of drying herbs hung to keep off fleas. Yes, bedtime had a smell. It was a mixture of lavender, decaying wool, and leftover roast buried under someone's bed for safekeeping. The idea of being clean before sleep was not necessarily about soap. It was about order, A swept hearth, a rinsed bucket, a prayer, a pail of water in case dreams caught fire. And now, dear listener, as your mind softens like beeswax left in the sun, perhaps it's time to set aside frothy wigs and bone-powdered brows. Let the lull of history cradle you, not with the freshness of modern soaps and loofahs, but with the curious comfort of knowing just how far we've come, and how strange the past once smelled. Flutter your eyes closed now. Let the candles burn themselves out. And if you hear a whisper in your dreams, do not worry. It's just an old wig, sighing from relief.